Yeah, so I'm passing out two things. One is a handout for the talk now, and the other is a call for paper. So I'm guest editing an issue in Agathios, which is the kind of new European journal for philosophy of religion because the old one got sold. So this is kind of the replacement for that. So I'm doing a guest issue on Buddhism and Hinduism, lots of different questions. Feel free to think about it. If you have anything to submit, be happy to talk with you. But as for the talk, I'm going to be talking on the Shintong tradition and classical theism. And this paper actually was recently published in Philosophy East and West, but it's still relevant to get feedback because I'm working on a Cambridge Elements right now on classical theism and Eastern philosophy, which I'm going to incorporate some of this material in. And also, if I have time, which I think I will, because I've timed this talk, I have kind of like an appendix to the paper where I'm going to talk about this one philosopher who I'll mention in a minute, Del Popa, and how he should kind of endorse metaphysical foundationalism. So kind of a two-part talk, if you'd say. All right, so first off, thank you very much for inviting me. Thank you for all the hospitality, all the friendships that's already occurred. It's been a pleasure. It's been a great time. So thank you for that. So I take it that the central metaphysical doctrines of Buddhism can be summarized as follows. Interdependence thesis, or ID, which says all things are conceptually and causally dependent on other things for their existence. Right? Impermanence thesis, or IM, no thing retains its identity from moment to moment. And emptiness thesis, EI, with the possible exception of dharmas, all things lack intrinsic and fixed nature. Obviously, within the Mahayana tradition, right? This is true. Thank you. According to the middle way tradition, EI is the result of ID and IM being true. So if a thing TG1 is conceptually and causally dependent on TG2, TG1 will fail to be considered an independent entity that has its own intrinsic nature. Sorry, its own intrinsic existence. Similarly, if TG1 fails to retain its identity from moment to moment, then TG1 lacks a fixed and enduring nature. On the middle way logic, ID and IM are more fundamental than EI. So impermanence and interdependence more fundamental than the emptiness thesis. Nonetheless, it's not uncommon for EI to be the focal point in analytic discussions. This being the case, it might initially seem odd that there exists attempts of reconciling the central metaphysical theses of Buddhism with classical theism. So classical theism is a view that endorses the following metaphysical thesis. Thesis 1, T1, God exists. Thesis 2, T2, God is wholly immutable. Thesis 3, T3, God is wholly impassible. And T4, thesis 4, God is metaphysically simple. So God is not made up of parts. For those of you who aren't familiar with that, might think kind of like Shankara, no qualities, right? Something like that, the highest level. So by T2, the classical theist means to endorse that God does not undergo intrinsic change. As Thomists have typically put it, God is pure actuality, right? So this is very Aristotelian, right? The idea is potency and act, and God is just pure act, no potencies whatsoever within him, right? It might seem that like God changes with respect to his actions. For example, it surely seems that his action of creating the world is distinct from resurrecting Jesus of Nazareth. But it isn't as if these acts are separate or that they happen at different times. These acts seem different from our perspective alone. These actions are all actually part of one of God's timeless acts. But it's not just that God lacks potential to change himself. T3 clarifies that God lacks potential to be acted on. That is, we cannot cause change in God. God lacks potential to change whatsoever. It's generally understood that while we are genuinely related to God, it's a one-way street. It's a one-way relationship. God is not really related to us in the same sort of way. Finally, by endorsing T4, the classical theist argues that God has no parts. That is, God is not made up of various properties. While we talk as if God is made up of various properties, like he's omniscient, omnibenevolent, so on and so forth, the property descriptions that we assign to God are only true by way of analogy. In a strict sense, then, the property descriptions are simply shorthand descriptions of one and the same reality, namely that God is, God exists. He is his own existence. Right? In a strict univocal sense, we should say that God possesses no properties. He is metaphysically simple. So here I'm following kind of typical scholastic terminology here, where you have univocal language where we're talking about the same exact object, right? Same sort of concept, same exact concept, and then equivocal language where we're saying the same word, but we totally mean different things, right? So, for example, if I said, Jose, can you give me Coke? You've already hear my love for sodas on this trip so far. And Jose didn't know anything about me, and he's like, he wants cocaine? What? He wants something illegal? We'd be using the same word, Coke, but totally different meanings, right? And so that's equivocal, right? So analogical language is that language that exists in between. It's not univocal, right? But it's not completely equivocal either, right? So classical theists think that language about God is analogical. And for someone like St. Thomas, it's analogy all the way down, right? So how can it be the case that classical theism is consistent with the aforementioned metaphysical theses of Buddhism, right? Again, Buddhism says interdependence, it says impermanence, right? All things are ultimately empty, right? Empty of own being. McNabb and Baldwin, recommend their book, by the way, in their volume Classical Theism and Buddhism, explore the concept of a thing. One way of construing a thing is the following. Here's a description of equivalence. T is a thing if and only if T can possess a property, or you can make a disjunctive and say T is a property. And here I'm talking about properties loosely. So if you want to talk about like tropes being properties and so forth, that includes that, which is a very kind of common construal of Buddhist metaphysics, trope theory. T is a thing if and only if T can't possess a property. T is a thing if and only if T can possess a property or is a property itself, right? McNabb and Baldwin go on to argue that since God lacks properties in a strict univocal sense, God is not a thing. Rather, in following with the Blackfriar Thomistic tradition, God is instead the grounding of all things. As Herbert McCabe puts it, and this is a little bit of a lengthy quote from him, it is clear that we reach out to, but do not reach an answer to our ultimate question. How come anything instead of nothing? But we are able to exclude some answers. If God is whatever answers our question, how come everything, then evidently he is not included amongst everything. God cannot be a thing, an existent among others. It is not possible that God and the universe should add up and make two. And here my Advaita Vedanta friends should be like, amen, right? Again, if we are to speak of God as causing the existence of everything, it is clear that we must not mean that he makes the universe out of anything. So basically, long story short, right? The idea is we're trying to find an explanation of all things, right? Why is there something rather than nothing, right? The age-old question, right? Why is there something rather than nothing? Why is there anything at all, right? And so in order to answer why there's anything at all, right, we need to appeal to something that's not a thing, something that's outside of the things, but nonetheless grounds or makes sense of the things, right? So inspired by the Neoplatonic tradition, McNabb and Baldwin go on to argue that God is no thing. Since interdependence and impermanence, if you see how I defined them earlier, right, apply to things, endorsing the theses does not entail that God must also be impermanent and interdependent. In this way, we can affirm the metaphysics of the center Buddhist tradition while also endorsing the theses of classical theism. So it's pretty much a simple argument, right? On the surface, it's actually quite simple. Interdependence and impermanence apply to things. God is not a thing. No need to apply to God. Right? So one criticism of their project, like people would criticize me, I don't know, goes something like this. McNabb and Baldwin's project, typical of analytic philosophy, right, is all historical. While McNabb and Baldwin's argument might go through with respect to some very generalized form of Buddhism, McNabb and Baldwin don't show that an actual Buddhist who belongs to a robust tradition can adhere to theism. So that's what the point of this paper is. In this paper, I will address the criticism by putting forth the hypothesis that the Shintong tradition, which is a Buddhist tradition within the Mahayana school, middle way tradition even, especially by its foremost promoter, Dolpopa, can be rendered in a logically consistent way with classical theism. The paper isn't so much an exhaustive attempt to establish that the hypothesis is true, but rather a first attempt to show that there is positive reason to think that the Shintong tradition can be interpreted as a consistent way, at least as it pertains to the metaphysics of Buddha's Shintong tradition and classical theism. So in order to do this, I'm first going to give you a brief history of the Shintong tradition. Second, I'll argue that there is reason to think the Shintong tradition fits well with classical theist tradition. Third, I'll engage two objections, and finally, I'll summarize what I've done. All right, so Dolpopa and the Shintong tradition. This is a tradition largely inspired by 3rd, 4th century Buddhist sutras, which I'll mention in a minute. But it really, Dolpopa takes place, medieval time frame. So the Shintong tradition was a tradition within the larger Mahayana school that centered around the esoteric knowledge of emptiness. The primary idea is that it can be said that phenomena we encounter are empty of their own being. But at the same time, behind the phenomena we experience, there is a reality that is not empty of own being. This is reality only empty of other phenomena. One could argue that the Buddha Sutras, which discuss the Buddha nature, foreshadow the Shintong tradition. And here I have one of its earliest proponents. I'll save the long quote. Basically, he says that not only were there 3 turns of the Dharma wheel, but actually 4, right? And this is the Shintong tradition is thinking that it's the true meaning of emptiness, that there is emptiness of other, but there is an emptiness that exists that is not empty of own nature. So the true nature of reality, at the ultimate level of reality, is the Buddha nature. This would become the central, unique doctrine of the Shintong tradition. Eventually, the great teacher Dolpopa would arise and systematize the doctrine most clearly. He found it important to show that the Shintong's understanding of the Buddha nature was consistent with the central Mahayana texts. For example, Nagarjuna's MMK, you might think, well, how do you get some permanent and immutable nature from the MMK? He's going to say the MMK applies only to kind of the realm of existent things, right? It only applies to phenomena. It shows that phenomena is really empty, but there's still something behind that. So phenomena we experience each and every day, that is empty. But still there's something which is permanent, the Buddha nature. And that is not empty of self-being. So what is the Buddha nature here? Dolpopa works titled The Fourth Council and his auto-commentary on the Fourth Council are of special interest, right? So in the Fourth Council, we see a demarcation between emptiness of other and emptiness of self-nature. Moreover, we see clearly Dolpopa's line of reasoning that there needs to be a permanent reality behind the phenomena we experience. So for Dolpopa, there is no impermanent and interdependent phenomena if there is no permanent and immutable Buddha nature. And so here, if you're a fan of Leibniz, maybe some of his classical arguments for God's existence, kind of contingency-styled arguments, you're going to be a fan of what Dolpopa has to say here. There's many places he says this. There's one particular place. If the permanent were negated, the impermanent would also be negated. If there were no Buddha, there would be no sentient beings. If there were no primordial awareness, there would be no consciousness. That which is primordial awareness of the basic space of phenomena is permanent, unconditioned, primordial awareness, beyond simile, immutable, fully established, great bliss. So Dolpopa, end quote, describes Buddha nature as primordial awareness, as permanent, immutable bliss. In fact, there are various places he describes the Buddha nature as omnipotent and omniscient, right? Utilizing those words exactly, right? So don't just think, this is a Westerner saying this about the tradition, right? Especially after our last talk. These are his words, and take it up with Stearns, who translates his work. So one standard criticism of the Shintong tradition is that its view of Buddha nature is not seen in older Indian sources. The idea is that the Shintong tradition has no historical precedent. It's but a medieval invention. Whether this is true or not, it's not too relevant for our own purposes, right? It's got to come up with one Buddhist tradition that people even still practice today, right? That seems like it endorses classical theism, or at least is consistent with classical theism. However, as a quick retort, Shintong proponents do actually, again, like I said, appeal to these early Buddhist sutras, and also philosophers like Asanga, who maybe you know him, and he's usually connected with Yogacara and so forth. But Asanga, I mean, I was actually reading his work on the way here to Brazil, and I had to keep telling myself, wait a minute, this actually isn't Del Popo writing, because I read a lot of Del Popo, and it just seems like Del Popo's writing it, but obviously he predates Del Popo. So Del Popo is more like writing like him, but I mean, it is quite similar. So in David Bentley Hart's The Experience of God, Hart brilliantly uses sources from the Abrahamic traditions and Vedantic traditions to show commonality that exists between the respective traditions. At the heart of the great traditions, there is pure consciousness, being, and bliss, right? That's the overall thesis of this book. There's that which ultimately grounds reality. There is a similar move here to make with the Shintong tradition. If you recall, classical theism endorses the thesis that God is immutable, impassible, metaphysically simple. Again, simplicity helps us conclude that God is no thing. But without God, there are no things. As shown above, Del Popo makes a similar claim about the Buddha nature that undergirds all reality. It's immutable, permanent. He calls it primordial awareness and pure bliss. If it weren't for the Buddha nature, there would be nothing. It's hard to read Del Popo and think that he isn't describing the same reality that so many other great traditions attempt to discuss. Yet as Del Popo makes clear, there is a sense in which similes don't even do justice in describing the Buddha nature. Reality is empty of other, but not empty of being simplifier. The ground for productive religious dialogue seems extremely fertile. As Francis Tiso has pointed out, Ippolito Desideri, a Jesuit missionary to Tibet in the 17th century, makes similar arguments. That actually should have been 18th century. Makes similar arguments in trying to convince his Buddhist counterparts that God exists. Desideri argues that all things are actually interdependent. All phenomena is actually empty of own being, and yet there is self-existence. He states, and I quote him, "The fact that all things are empty of independence is not a truth only known to the middle way. My doctrine teaches it too. On the like, we think alike." So he's basically saying, yeah, like this whole idea of interdependence thesis, that's my view too, right? Christianity teaches that as well, right? So he makes clear that there needs to be self-existence if there are things that are going to be interdependent. And he uses emptiness as well to apply this to you. All right, so now what does it mean that the Buddha nature undergirds all reality? Is it right to say that I am the Buddha nature, right? If my personal identity is illusionary and behind my existence is simply the self-existence, then wouldn't this be affirming a radical monistic metaphysic rather than the metaphysics of classical theism? So David Rugg famously linked Shankara's Advaita Vedanta tradition with Del Popo's interpretation of emptiness by calling Del Popo's interpretation quasi-Vedantic. I think Rugg is right here to point out similarities, but I don't actually find this problematic. For Shankara, doesn't need to be interpreted as radically monistic. You might think, oh, what? So, in fact, as Daniel Soares, he has an excellent volume with Fordham Press called The World and God Are Not Two. Soares attempts to synthesize Thomas Aquinas with Shankara on his interpretation. God is not a thing, but the grounding of all things, as I've suggested above. In this way, God's existence should not be treated like a thing. God is not therefore in competition with objects of reality. He's not in competition with other things. It's not like we count God, reality, right? Two things, right? No. He is on an entirely different playing field, a playing field that makes objects competing against one another possible. When we talk about ultimate reality, it is right to say that there is just God alone. God is ultimate reality. The Catholic tradition is very clear on this. This being the case, we can say there aren't two that exist, namely God and the world. Aquinas, like Shankara, denies a dualistic metaphysic. Of course, we can't say that only God is, in every sense of the term for Aquinas. Substances are said to exist for Aquinas, though in some lesser fundamental sense. Substances are supposed to participate in existence, after all. So radical monism isn't an option. but it seems right to deny that there are two nonetheless. And this is how Soares suggests that we interpret the Veda tradition. Soares isn't suggesting, though, a novel Christian interpretation of Shankara. However, in personal correspondence with one of the foremost Vedanta scholars in the Western world, at least, Rambachan, I asked Rambachan if Shankara has room for the existence of distinct phenomena that nonetheless participate in Brahman. I was told, I'm quoting him, "Your language of participation is interesting and possible. If by participation you mean that nothing exists apart from Brahman, nothing exists independently of Brahman, and while there may be things that have unique attributes, at the most fundamental level, it is all Brahman." It seems way too quick then to reject the compatibility of Dolpopa's metaphysics and classical theism because Shintang simply shares a quasi-Vedantic metaphysic. Even granting that it does, there is more work to be done to show that Shankara and classical theists like St. Thomas have incompatible thoughts. So, of course, more needs to be done, whether Dolpopa is a quasi-Vedanta advocate and whether or not he has room in his ontology for at least some level of existence for plurality, right? Nonetheless, I'm suggesting so far there appears to be fertile ground between Dolpopa's metaphysics and the metaphysics of a kind of classical theism, at least the classical theism espoused by St. Thomas Aquinas, maybe not so much by, say, someone like Scotus, who's not going to be all the way down with analogy of being, but still within obviously the Thomistic tradition's pretty big tradition within classical theism. So, and here I think the concern for McNabb and Baldwin's argument for logical consistency, that it needs to be put in practical and real religious context, can also be met. All right, so perhaps the objector concedes my point here, but reformulates the objection like this, right? Maybe they think the Shintang tradition is like a heretical tradition, and they're like, it's not orthodox, right? So, okay, sure, there is like a non-orthodox Buddhist tradition that can make sense of the theses of classical theism. But give me like an orthodox one, give me like a straight Nagarjuna, MMK, give me, some other tradition within Buddhism that I will deem as true Buddhism, right? And so I'd argue that there are texts within the Pali Canon which clearly speak of nirvana being an uncreated and permanent reality. There's one text that talks about how nirvana is uncreated and the highest bliss. There are influential texts that state that nirvana is unconditioned, i.e. impermanence and interdependence don't apply to nirvana. In Mahayana texts like the Lotus Sutra, they go on to blend the lines between Buddha and nirvana. Moreover, some Buddhist traditions in the Far East have placed a special emphasis on the immanent nature, Buddha nature that exists within all reality. So Perry Schmidt Lumpel, I'm not exactly sure how you pronounce the German name, points out that in Shinran Shonin, who claims that Buddha nature was really none other than Amida Buddha. So he links Amida Buddha with Buddha nature, seeing personal aspects of the Buddha nature even. Now, my claim isn't that all Buddhist traditions which interpret nirvana to be a transcendent permanent reality or one that interprets the Buddha nature in much in the same way is consistent with classical theism. But it's far from obvious they are at least at odds. And given all this, it isn't clear to me that the Shintang tradition is not a genuine Buddhist tradition. So basically, if you're knocking the Shintang tradition because you're like, it has permanent reality and immutable reality, oh, that's not Buddhist, that's not Orthodox. The retort is, okay, well, what about nirvana? Nirvana is the same way, at least in some traditions, right? So especially with some of the earlier Theravada traditions, there's like an attempt to say nirvana is just simply the ceasing of suffering. It's kind of this purely negative view. But there definitely does seem to be places in the Pali Canon where it seems to be saying something stronger than that. And so my point is, if there's some positive articulations of nirvana and the Pali Canon, then it's not just unorthodox simply because it endorses something that's permanent and interdependent. And independent. All right, so that's the paper. I want to continue on if I have a few more minutes. Do I have a few more minutes?
Yeah.
Okay. And I want to kind of some stuff that after I published the paper, I started working on and thinking about. And that is, how to be a Buddhist metaphysical foundationalist, because it seems that Dolpopa is indeed a metaphysical foundationalist, right? So a metaphysical foundationalist, we'll talk about exactly what that is, but the Buddha nature is the foundation in which everything kind of rests. And so here to be distinguished between epistemic foundationalism, I'm not saying he's an epistemic foundationalist, but I'm talking about metaphysical foundationalism, because obviously you can apply those same epistemic categories of infinitism and coherentism and foundationalism to metaphysics and of grounding, right? So I take it that metaphysical foundationalism is the thesis that there's that which is fundamental to members of a chain, where what is fundamental can be said to ground the members of a chain. For example, if I ask what brought about humans, you'd likely give me some sort of Darwinian story. And I could ask further questions like, what about these conditions that bring about that? And you could give me a further story, maybe about the Earth or about the fine tuning of the universe, right? And you could continue to kind of ask these questions, go deeper and deeper and deeper in answers. But the idea is that ultimately we're going to have some sort of ultimate stopping point. So the Buddhist philosopher Jan Westerhoff argues that at the most fundamental level, whatever exists will have to bear its properties intrinsically. But given interdependence, he goes on to say that this would be impossible. Right? There are no intrinsic natures, right? All is empty of self-being. And so if at the fundamental level, there's supposed to be properties, there just can't be properties at the most fundamental level because of interdependence. Right? So he denies foundationalism. While Dolpopa ultimately argues that knowledge of the Buddha nature comes by way of having special access to reality through non-ordinary means of not knowing, nonetheless, he thinks that we can have a justified belief about its reality by way of an argument. So Dolpopa again gives a contingency-styled argument for permanent reality, endorses foundationalism. I have a long quote from him, but you can put it in like a syllogism, right? He doesn't put it in a syllogism, but you can put one in a syllogism. Something like premise one, if interdependent and permanent phenomena exist, then permanent and immutable reality exists. Impermanent and interdependent phenomena do exist, therefore permanent and immutable reality exists, right? Something like that. But how could he do this if Westerhoff's argument is sound? As I mentioned elsewhere, classical theists think that God is not a thing, but beyond the realm of existent things, and as such, doesn't strictly speaking have properties. Westerhoff's argument assumes that foundationalism entails that properties exist at the ultimate layer of reality, but this need not be the case. If this is assumed, the objection doesn't have force against the classical theist. And so, as I've argued, Dolpopa's central metaphysical commitments are consistent with the commitments of of classical theism, so it's plausible that Dolpopa can co-opt the same strategy, right? But here's another objection that I think is actually more pressing, more worrying. If all things are conceptually and causally dependent on other things for their existence, this is similar to how J. Garfield defines it, where he states that no event or entity is independent of other events or entities for its existence. How can it be that God, or for Dolpopa, the Buddha nature, is the explanation for why there is impermanent and interdependent phenomena? If according to interdependence thesis, interdependent phenomena causally depend on other things. If we consider the Buddha nature is beyond entity or non-entity, it is not a thing, right? And that's actually how Taranatha, a later proponent of Dolpopa, an interpreter of the Dolpopa, he creates in a dialogue, pretend dialogue with Dolpopa, and Dolpopa says, God is not a thing or not thing, right? He's this third thing, right? This third category. So wouldn't this mean that interdependent phenomena are explained not by that which is beyond a thing, but by other things? So basically the objection, if I've lost you here, is this. Interdependence thesis says that all things have explanation by other things. If God's not a thing, then can God really be the explanation of interdependent phenomena, which require an explanation of things, right? If God is not a thing. So suppose I collect all impermanent and interdependent things. Is the collection of all the impermanent and interdependent things a thing? If so, according to ID, interdependence thesis, it must be caused by another thing. Not only is this not a coherent metaphysical picture, for an additional thing would need to be in the initial collection of all things, but the Buddha nature would not be eligible for an explanation. For all things are causally dependent on other things, then Buddha nature is not a thing. At best, the Buddha nature would play an overdetermined role in explaining the members of a sect. At worst, the Buddha nature plays no explanatory role, and Del Popo's contingency-styled arguments from ordinary reason seems to be in jeopardy. Right? All right, so I'm going to skip a little bit, but perhaps there is no new thing that comprises all impermanent and interdependent reality. There's just a plurality of things arranged universe-wise, or some interconnected-wise. In this case, the plurality of interdependent or impermanent phenomena arranged in a certain way still would require an explanation. For there is a need for an explanation for why the things are arranged or connected in the way that they are. It does no good to explain one turtle's existence, right, by another turtle's existence and just simply say turtles all the way down, right? There's still a question as to why is there an infinite set of turtles, right? Why not an infinite set of dogs or cats? Why an infinite set at all, right? So we need to get beyond or outside the turtles to answer this question. And yet if the collection itself isn't an additional thing, a thing isn't required to be part of that explanation. So basically, if you deflate the idea of the collection of all these impermanent things, if you say, there really is no thing, which is the collection of all things, right? We just say, no, there's just maybe an infinite series of things that are connected together, right? Then this is not itself a thing, and it doesn't require an explanation of a thing, but it still requires an explanation of sorts, and that explanation could be the Buddha nature, right? So anyway, it seems to me that's the best sort of strategy to take for the Shintong tradition. All right, thank you very much.